Traveller's Tales with Leo Devine.
Hello and welcome to Traveller's Tales with me, Leo Devine, on Premier Christian Radio. My guest this week really needs no introduction, but I'm going to do one anyway. From pop star to priest to TV and radio presenter, prolific author in both fiction and non-fiction, and all round, you might say, I'm sure by now, a national treasure. Who could it be other than the Reverend Richard Coles? Richard, what do you think? Do you think you qualify for being a national treasure by now, surely?
I've no idea. David used to call me a borderline national trinket, and I'll take that, I think. But I always feel I'm just poised on the brink of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. So I'll probably get cancelled for doing something unthinking or untoward. So I wouldn't bank on it.
I'm sure that's never going to happen. And you've got, I think, is it 500,000 followers on Twitter?
I think so, yeah, something like that.
Well, I think you're a national treasure anyway. And certainly by any measure, your journey through to priesthood is by any measure, I guess, at the very least, not traditional. Let's put it that way.
I mean, the call of God comes in all sorts of ways and to all sorts of people, doesn't it? So I sometimes think my story is a bit exotic. I mean, it didn't feel like it to me because it was just, your life. But when I was in theological college, I kept finding things out about my peers that were constantly surprising. So I think mine's just been a bit more public, probably.
Well, let's go back to the beginning. We'll come back to the priesthood, but let's go back to the beginning and all the way back to Northampton and the heart of boot and shoe, as in terms of an industry. And that was really your family, wasn't it? Because your dad owned a shoe factory, and it, I guess, quite a middle-class upbringing, was it?
I think so. It was a family firm that had been started by my great-grandfather. And there was, on the other side, there was a great-grandfather who was an inventor who invented lots of the machinery that mechanized shoe production. So they were hard-nosed Midland manufacturers, would I think, but the wealth that created transformed them from being humbly born. Well, it didn't transform that, but it changed their life. And so they sort of became posher as they went on. They bought their way into a gentler life. And they'd done that by the time I came along. But as my closest friend, Matthew, once observed, there is a hard-nosed Midland manufacturer not far from the surface in me, and I think he's right.
You ended up in London, shall we say, in what was the maelstrom of that sort of late 70s, early 80s, leading, a chaotic life compared, I guess, to that middle-class upbringing in Northampton, full of politics, full of self-awareness. What was it like at that time?
One of the realizations that came to me when I was hitting my adolescence was that I was gay, and that I just knew that if there was a livable life, it wasn't going to be there, that I would have to go and find it. And I was fortunate enough to be born at a time when pioneers had gone before me and had marked out a place where you could lead that livable life, and that was London. And it was against my nature because I'm naturally rather a timid person and I'm not particularly adventurous, quite the opposite. But I just knew that if I didn't do it, I would die. And I had to. So I did. I got on a train and I went to London and stepped into this completely unfamiliar world, middle class, Middle England, former chorister, threw in my lot with people who were completely unlike me, whose assumptions were different, whose basic experience of life was different. And it was the making of me, really. It was challenging and it was threatening and it was exciting and it was brilliant.
I reread your biography again recently that you published in 2014, and so much happened to you, but you're very self-effacing and I think quite judgmental on yourself. You're living in this sort of amazing period of transition, but constantly seemingly questioning yourself. Is that true?
Yes, I think that is true. I think I've partly because I'd rather get there before somebody else did, if you see what I mean. But I think it's part of my nature, really. And I think to my detriment then, but I think what Christianity offers, one of the things Christianity offers you is critical self-examination with an end that is to your benefit, not your detriment. So I learned through Christianity to understand myself better and to know what it is to be forgiven and to live a life that's transformed by that. And that is a wonderful thing.
And was there any flame of Christianity at this point?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I mean, I think I used to sneak off to midnight mass sometimes. I remember going, I was in New York one Christmas, we were recording an album, and I had Mark Ashton, who was a great political activist of the day. He was staying, and we sneaked off to midnight mass at St. Patrick's, Fifth Avenue. And we were both then, I mean, I remember we turned up and we were wearing like Crombie overcoats and DM boots and 501s. We looked like these kind of London skinheads. And we turned up and it was ticket only. And then a lady who got out of a stretch limousine saw us and she said, "Are you coming?" I said, "Well, we can't get in." She said, "Well, you can have my tickets." And she gave us her tickets. And so we went and we found ourselves sitting in a pew in what felt like the middle of the Kennedy family or something, looking very out of place. But why did we do that? Well, I think we both knew that there was something in it we wanted to connect with.
It's funny you tell that story, and you mentioned that in your biography as well, but it's almost like the opposite of class struggle. There you were running away from this kind of revolutionary life to go to church.
Yeah. And then, but I think, what was that about? Well, I think partly it was, and this is I think quite a common experience for gay men of my age and generation, was that our lives began when we ran away and found a livable version. But of course, your life doesn't begin then. It means that I think often you become a stranger to your own past. Mm. And I think one of the attractions of church for me was that it was where I had started out, and I wanted to reconnect with that because I think I wanted to maybe understand myself better, or I couldn't leave it. I felt incomplete without turning to face where I'd come from, as well as looking forward to where I was going.
It strikes me that your life is constantly about transition. So there you were in London, as I said, leading quite, by your own admission, quite a chaotic lifestyle. And then suddenly, and again, we're kind of jumping over all sorts of experiences, but you'd already met Jimmy Savile, who'd been in Bronski Beat. He invites you to join his band, or to at least musically interact with him, and you become incredibly successful, #1 hits. And your life again transitioned into this crazy pop star world. I mean, how do you kind of transition into that?
I think it's water skiing, basically. I think you just stand up and hold on, and everything moves really quickly around you, and you just try to keep standing up. I mean, it came as a sort of answer to a prayer also, because I'd always longed for it, I think. And then this opportunity came along, and I took it. And it was, felt like a vindication in lots of ways. It was incredibly exciting. Pop music in those days was really turbocharged, and it was great. But it was also very demanding, and something that I found quite difficult, actually. And that was really to do with feeling that I was the Cinderella in the operation, really, and that Jimmy was the one who was getting, rightly, of course, the attention. And I felt rather in his shadow, and I wilted a little bit in that. And I wanted to have more spotlight, because those, that fare is addictive, and once you start scoffing it, you want more, I think, at first, and then you kind of get a bit more sensible about it. It's a useful thing to have an early success of that kind, because I think it inoculates you against the more pernicious effects of fame and attention when you're older.
I think it's something that a lot of people can relate to, though, Richard, insofar as, you strike me as an incredibly kind and generous person, but injustice gets to you, and inside you harbor this kind of grudge that you want some of the limelight, but at the same time you want to push it away because that's not really you. Again, is that somewhere near to the point?
I think so. I mean, we are complex creatures, aren't we? I think it's important to me to kind of look nice, but of course, like everybody else, I have my own self-seeking stratagems and my own issues,
don't we all?
My own darkness. And I've become more relaxed about owning that, I think, as I've got older. I think perhaps in the past I tried to deny it because it presented a version of myself that I wasn't really comfortable with. Mm. But another thing you learn, isn't it, through discipline of discipleship, is God is not interested in the version of ourselves that we wish to present. God's interested in who we are.
That's a really lovely way of putting it. And before we move away from that whole period in your life, which could fill a dozen interviews in itself, I mean, there's one story where you say that when you sign a big recording contract, which you did, there's normally a golden hello. And the more kind of frivolous of us would have chosen maybe a big sports car or something as a golden hello. What did you choose?
A washer dryer.
Yes.
Only because I didn't know. So they were, they were part of the thing. So it could have been, I don't know, a car or a motorbike or something. But they just said, "What would you like?" And I said, "Well, like a washer dryer." So I got a washer dryer, which actually turned out to be the most durable thing I think I've ever got from pop music. Tinnitus, but there you are.
So explain to me. This is the next transition from that suddenly glamorous lifestyle where I mean, you were earning a lot of money by then, and you were a pop star. You were recognized everywhere. How on earth does Christianity and this journey to priesthood find its way in through that small crack in the window?
Oh, well, as the poet Charles Sisson said, the vainly ambitious and the highly sexed are the natural prey of the incarnate Christ. How true it is. Because I think I was burning, I was on fire, consumed by that life and by everything in it. And eventually I kind of ran out and woke up one morning and thought, I don't know who I am and I need to find out. And all I was conscious of really was this sort of like whale music, this sort of indistinct but haunting and unignorable sound that came out of the depths to me. And I thought, I don't know what that is. It's nothing like what I've heard before. It's not what I'm looking for. I've never even noticed it before. But I sort of had to tune in. And that's what drew me to eventually to a church. I remember standing on the threshold of the church, hostile, skeptical. And when I came out, it had reversed, and I knew I was a participant.
Where was that church?
St Albans, Holborn, one of the great Anglo-Catholic shrines of London, built in what were then slums in that Anglo-Catholic revival. And then it sort of maintained this incredibly exotic and beautiful liturgy and witness. But there was a wonderful vicar called John Gaskell, who was vicar when I started going there, and he was just a lovely, lovely man. And he was one of those people who made Christianity look possible. You can do this, you can make that commitment, you can live your life in this way without it costing your integrity or your honesty. And I just thought, well, I'd like some of that, really.
How did your friends react? I mean, here's a guy who'd received a case of Dom Perignon from Elton John when you were at number one. And suddenly there's a very different Richard Coles on the scene. How did they react?
I would say, first of all, that a diet of endless Dom Perignon isn't so great, actually. After a while, you can get sick of it. But hey, first world problem.
I'm more of a Ribena guy myself. Or
I think I am too, actually. Well, I think my closest friends could see that what was happening within me was genuine and was speaking to parts of myself that needed to be spoken to. One of my closest friends had already secretly, surreptitiously started going to church. And so we kind of swapped notes a little bit. I remember one man asking me, I went to college to study theology. And I remember one man asked me if I bumped into him in a pub, and he said, "Oh, what are you doing now?" And I said, "Oh, I'm at university." He said, "Oh, what are you doing?" And I said, "Theology." And he went, "Geology." And I said, "No, theology." And he couldn't hear the word. He thought I was doing geology. So I think some were a bit mystified by it. Some, I think, were a bit challenged at this idea that a gay man would want to get involved with an organization which perhaps more than any other stood against what we were seeking to achieve, which was equality. And that's a good question. I remember Jimmy Somerville, who I thought who was a very activist and unbiddable person. I thought he might struggle with it, but he very sweetly, he was living in San Francisco at the time. He sent me a copy of a book of prayers for the lesbian and gay community, which was very nice of him.
Your journey really began with Catholicism, didn't it? I mean, that was the beginning of that journey.
Not quite. I mean, I sort of re-entered Christianity, or rather entered it for the first time as a kind of participant in the sort of extreme of the Anglo-Catholic end of the spectrum. But that's a very short step from there to Roman Catholicism. And I think if you are in that part of the Anglican spectrum, you often think, why am I not a Roman Catholic, original and best? And so I did. And I did about 9 years, I think, as a Roman Catholic, partly because I was deeply fascinated by monasticism, and at one point thought I'd quite like to see if I could live as a Benedictine. And there were just simply more options in the Roman offer than in the Anglican offer. And I think I did want the rigor of Roman Catholicism, the universalism of Roman Catholicism. And the stuff that in Anglicanism, it's sort of hesitancy about being too propositional, it's fuzziness, it's via media, felt insufficient somehow. And then after doing Roman Catholicism for about 9 years, I realized that that was exactly what I wanted. I became a Roman Catholic to discover I was in Church of England.
It's interesting, again, for a man who had lived in the absolute spotlight of the world to say to me, I was very interested in monasticism. Was that a sense of trying to find some sort of solitude or an escape from what you'd previously experienced?
No, I mean, there might have been something in the beginning, but of course, it doesn't take very long if you start hanging out with monks to discover that if you thought this was an escape from something, well, you've got that completely
It's
wrong.
not.
It's the opposite, in fact. No, I think it's genuinely, there's a large part of me that is a monk. And I know that I spent 2 years living in a monastery, an Anglican monastery, and I know that a chunk of me is still there and always will be there.
And you came back to Anglicanism and, of course, then sorted ordination. How did that happen?
Well, I tried to put off ordination for as long as I possibly could because I thought it wouldn't be, I don't know, just something worth putting off, I think. And also, it behoves us, I think, to not rush in an unseemly way towards our destiny, okay? But when I did come back to the Church of England, once I'd accepted that that's where I belonged, it came into focus quite sharply. And it was actually Mo Mowlam, who was a good friend of mine. And Mo was then Northern Ireland secretary, and I kind of enough to be getting on with, right? And also she had her first brush with the glioblastoma that's very tragically was to kill her. But like lots of people who've had something like that happen, she didn't really have time for shilly-shallying on important stuff. And in the end, she said to me, listen, you need to test this. You need to find out if this really is for you, and you need to make a phone call. And she made me call the diocesan director of ordinance. And that was the beginning of the process that ended up with me getting ordained.
And of course, you conducted her funeral, very sadly.
I did, yeah, which was a very unusual funeral indeed. We all sang Working Class Hero with all the swear words in. And also, I've been out drinking with her husband the night before, and we had terrible hangovers.
Speaking of loss, very sadly, and grief, your most recent book, The Madness of Grief, which you call a memoir of love and loss, is an achingly honest and open account about your own grief, your experience of grief, and of course, the loss of your partner, David. That must have been a very hard book to write.
I thought about it before I wrote it, thinking, what sort of a book is this meant to be? And I got permission from his family because I didn't want to write it without their blessing. And then I wrote it. And you know, if you're going to write it, then write it. Tell the story. And the story was not an easy story to tell. But I couldn't think of a way of doing it. If I was going to do it, well then, I mean, it's never full disclosure because you are always a bit more careful than that. But I did want it to be comprehensible, and that meant telling stuff about David that was difficult, telling stuff about myself that was difficult. But I mean, there's a long history of that in Christian literature, isn't there? Of the confessional discourse. Some friends of mine think it was too much, that I revealed too much or overshare. But
I think for many of us who'd been following your career and your life and felt, I suppose, bizarrely close to you, you know, not to put too fine a point on it, I guess it was a revelation to think that you had been struggling and looking after David, and that we didn't know about the problems. And that, I guess, was also what was so revelatory and almost shocking, but you were so open, and it deeply, deeply touched a lot of people.
Yeah, it did. I mean, it was, I think anyone who's lived with an addict will know what that's like.
We should say that David died of alcoholism.
Of alcoholism, yeah. And anyone who's lived with an addict, whether it's alcohol, whatever it might be, will kind of know how difficult it is to kind of live in the world and do things you have to do, and at the same time manage all the kind of challenges that come with that. But I just did it because I had to do it, and I loved David, and he loved me, and we just had to deal with it as best we could. It was really hard sometimes, and I just did that thing that people do. I just thought, well, I just had to get through the next hour or the next day or the next week, and and just try and find a way. It's interesting. I mean, lots of people I know bail out of marriages to people with addictions, and I would never judge anyone for doing that, because especially if there are children involved, you just have to make very tough choices sometimes. And friends of mine would say to me, "Oh, you must bail out, you must bail out." And I kind of knew they were right in a way, but I also knew I wasn't going to do it. And I think I must have known on some level that David wouldn't make old bones.
You wrote in the book, it's like someone is drowning and you throw them a life belt and then just not taking the life belt.
Yeah, I mean, it's the hardest thing is they're related, actually. One was you look at someone and you think, don't raise the glass to your lips. Just don't do that. Just don't drink, because it's destroying you and it's destroying me and it's destroying our life. So don't do it. And they do it. And that is really, really difficult. And then when you challenge them about it, their addiction is so well defended by subterfuge and dishonesty and distraction that you can't get any purchase in it, and it is irrational. And if you're trying to, one of my greatest fears is being stuck having to be rational with people who are being irrational. Mm-hmm. Somebody once said to me, that's a pretty odd predicament for someone who's a representative of a religion, but hey, but that was really, really difficult. And I was at my wit's end, but I had lots of support around me. The parish was wonderful. My friends were. And also, I thought about this the other day. If I'd had, knowing what I know now, would I have said yes to David when we got together? And the answer is yes, I would.
We all feel that we know you so well from your presence online, your appearances, the way you talk, the way you speak, the way you write. How are you? How are you doing now? We all want to know.
I mean, I suppose the judicious answer to that would be I'm pretty much where I should be, I think. So just from my knowledge of other people who are widowed, I think I'm probably more or less where I'm just approaching the 3rd anniversary of David's death. Everyone I know who's walked this walk as well as me says, don't even think about getting yourself together until 5 years has gone by. So I think I'm probably in the second half of that first chunk of getting used to it. It's lonely. It's really lonely. And that's the tough thing. I'm living a new life. I'm in a new place. I'm surrounded by people. I have great friends. But I've lost the person who was my first choice and whose first choice I was. And it's really lonely. Sometimes it's really lonely.
What do you do to try and stop that loneliness? Is that where God, faith, Jesus, what is it that you call upon in order to help you through this period?
I just suck it up. Partly because it's a tribute I can pay to David, I think. So that's important. But also it's much more like the desolation of the cross. It's much more like Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani than anything comforting. But I kind of know it's going to be like that. I know that, Christianity takes you to Calvary, and I accept that,
But in that moment when Jesus says, God, why have you forsaken me? There is redemption. The end of the story is not where the cross is it?
Well, and I know that there is, on the far side of everything, no matter how terrible or dark or cruel or random it is, there's dawn rises in the graveyard and the tomb is empty, and all of a sudden we blink and sniff the air and find ourselves in a world that's transformed. And I think we know enough of that in this life to sustain our hope for it beyond.
Well, I deeply hope, we're talking in a metaphor, I understand that, but I deeply hope that sense of resurrection from that position of being grief-struck comes to you, Richard, very soon. You're retired now. Can we say retired?
Well, no, but literally I'm a retired incumbent. So I retired as Vicar of Findon after Easter this year. I'm no less busy than ever I was, but I don't have responsibility for a parish, and I don't have a sort of formal representative role within the church, and that's been interesting.
So what are you going to fill the time with? Are we going to see you more on television?
I like staying at home and writing. So lots more writing, I think. I like making radio programs. I do a bit of that for as long as people want me to do it. I don't want to be away all the time. And I want to, I mean, at the moment, what I'm really interested in is discovering what it's like not to be a vicar, because it's one of those jobs that defines you without you being fully aware of it. And I'm sort of decompressing, I guess, from that now. And I'm not wearing my dog collar very much. I mean, I wear a dog collar if it's a churchy thing, but I have no formal standing in the parish where I live. So I'm just getting used to not being the vicar. And some of that's great, actually, rather liberating. And some of it is very hard because I like being a vicar.
Richard, as I said at the beginning, we've only just met, but I feel like so many people that I've known you for years because we're interested in you. And quite honestly, we care about you. And I know you've been through so much, and I am so deeply grateful to you for sharing your traveller's tale with us today. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks. It was lovely talking to you.
You've been listening to Traveller's Tales with me, Leo Divine, on Premier Christian Radio. And I'll be back again next week at the same time with another Traveller's Tales. Bye-bye.
Traveller's Tales with Leo Divine.